You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 486 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, we left off last time with Ulysses S. Grant's electrifying statement of intent when he said, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer."
When Ulysses S. Grant sized up the events of May 10th, he reached a number of conclusions, the most important of which was that Upton's charge, if properly supported, would have resulted in the decisive victory that had so far eluded the Federals.
Camp gossip blamed the failure, quite unfairly, on Mott's division. And Grant accepted this assessment. Yet, in reality, the Army of the Potomac as a whole wasn't exactly carrying out orders with a snap in its step, and this seemed particularly the case with Warren's Fifth Corps. The success of Upton's attack and the scapegoating of Mott's division diverted attention from the new Sixth Corps commander Horatio Wright's indecisiveness, while the fact that Ward's brigade had briefly cracked the rebel line obscured the failure of most of Hancock's Second Corps to even attack.
But Gouverneur K. Warren's unenthusiastic role in the evening attack was impossible to ignore. Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana, who observed it, reported to his boss, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, that Warren's assault, quote, was executed with the caution and absence of comprehensive ensemble, which seemed to characterize that officer, end quote. Dana almost certainly told Ulysses S. Grant much the same thing, and Grant, who had earlier considered Warren an outstanding field officer, began to rethink his assessment.
Robert E. Lee's assessment of the day's events was much different than Grant's. In a dispatch to Richmond composed that evening, Lee reported that although the enemy had made several assaults against him during the day, these were, quote-unquote, easily repulsed. Except at the Mule Shoe, where Upton's Federals had scored their temporary success, but Lee could report that even there, the Confederate line had been reestablished by dark. Lee also said that Jubal Early drove back an attempt to turn the Army's left flank. And in contrast to Grant's speculation that the rebels must be suffering heavy losses, Lee made a point of reporting, quote, "Thanks to a merciful providence, our casualties have been small."
However, Robert E. Lee did have things to worry about, and his concerns crystallized around three things. First was the new threat to Richmond and Petersburg posed by Ben Butler's Federals, who were now firmly ashore at Bermuda Hundred and starting to probe toward one of the vital railroads linking Richmond with the lower South.
This threat couldn't be ignored, which meant that badly needed reinforcements weren't reaching Lee's army, but instead were being diverted to check Butler. That was bad enough, but worse was the possibility that Lee might have to detach troops from his army to help stop Butler. And the bad news didn't end there. Phil Sheridan had taken most of the Federal cavalry and set out on a major raid. Jeb Stuart was in pursuit of the Yankees with 3 brigades of Confederate horsemen, but the enemy had already destroyed Lee's forward supply base at Beaver Dam Station on the Virginia Central Railroad. There, hundreds of thousands of rations had gone up in flames.
Finally, and most vexing to Lee, he had so far been unable to wrest the initiative from Grant. It frustrated Robert E. Lee that the Federals' constant maneuvering and this ceaseless barrage of assaults meant that he, Lee, was forced to remain on the defensive.
The next move was therefore up to Grant, and Lee had to prepare for it. He brought Heath's division back to Spotsylvania Courthouse, leaving only Mahone's division west of the Po River to guard against another attempt to turn the Army's left flank. Lee was more concerned about the Mule Shoe salient, especially since the Yankees' evening assault there had seemed to have pierced the Confederate line at that spot rather easily. In any case, Lee instructed Dick Ewell to be prepared for a renewal of the fighting at daylight, and even urged Ewell to be on guard against a night attack, since Lee had heard erroneously that, quote, it was a favorable amusement of Grant's at Vicksburg.
Ulysses S. Grant didn't attempt a night attack, nor did he renew the fighting the next morning. But, like Robert E. Lee, Grant had been impressed by Upton's success at the Mule Shoe. He reportedly declared, "A brigade today, we'll try a corps tomorrow."
By noon on the 11th, Grant had made up his mind to launch a new attack over the same ground that Mott's division had crossed in its ill-fated effort the day before. Further reconnaissance revealed for the first time the full outline of the Confederate position. Grant and Meade now had a fair idea of the shape and dimensions of the Mule Shoe salient and realized that its apex must lie along Mott's axis of advance.
A military truism held that the apex of a salient was difficult to defend because the defender's ability to lay down effective fire was compromised by the shape of the position, and so a really strong assault stood a good chance of success, particularly if it employed the tactics that Upton used successfully in his attack.
By mid-afternoon, Grant had committed the Army of the Potomac to a major attack on the Mule Shoe. He instructed Meade to move Hancock's 2nd Corps behind Warren's 5th Corps and Wright's 6th Corps under cover of night, so that it would be in position to join Burnside's 9th Corps in a strong assault on the rebels at 4 a.m. on the morning of the 12th. Grant assured Meade that he'd make certain Burnside understood the need to make a prompt, determined attack, and he instructed Meade to order Warren and Wright to hold their corps ready to exploit any opportunity the main assault might open up.
The Federal Corps commanders received their new orders around 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 11th. About 2 hours later, at 6 p.m., they met with George Meade.
Meade told Warren that 5th Corps would hold both its own position and also that portion of the line vacated by 2nd Corps.
Wright's 6th Corps would function as a general reserve.
Hancock's 2nd Corps would make the main attack on the Mule Shoe, directly supported by Burnside's 9th Corps.
As per Grant's instructions, both Warren and Wright were to hold themselves ready to receive new orders and carry them out promptly.
When the meeting adjourned, Hancock returned to his headquarters and had a conference with his division commanders. The key man here was Francis Barlow, whose division would spearhead the attack on the Mule Shoe, supported by Mott and Birney's divisions.
Hancock's other division, commanded by John Gibbon, would pull out last, turning over 2nd Corps' positions to the troops of Warren's 5th Corps.
Right. Well, at any rate, Barlow wasn't happy when Hancock informed him it would be his division spearheading the attack on the Mule Shoe. He was told nothing about the number of rebel troops holding the salient, nothing about the specific support he was to receive from Mott and Birney's divisions. He'd never seen the ground over which his troops would advance. He'd never even visited the attack's jumping-off point, a farmhouse 1,400 yards north of the Confederate position. As if to further dampen Barlow's mood, a heavy rainstorm had just drenched the troops, the roads, and the woods and fields.
Barlow passed the word to his brigades to pull out of line and march to the jumping-off point for the attack on the Mule Shoe. The same instructions went out to the men of Gibbon and Birney's divisions. One Federal soldier recalled, quote, "It did not take long to obey the order. Each one had only to rise from the earth, shake himself in vain to get rid of the chills that were ever coursing up and down the spine on nights like this, wring the water out of his shoes, lift the cold, heavy musket from the stack, and all was ready."
The division stopped first at 2nd Corps headquarters to pick up 2 staff officers who supposedly knew the way. However, they seemed no happier about the operation than Barlow, and scarcely more knowledgeable about what was going on. At this point, a sort of gallows humor seemed to overcome Barlow, who admitted, "I could hardly sit on my horse for laughter. I remember that I finally said to Colonel Morgan, one of the staff officers, 'For heaven's sake, at least face us in the right direction, so that we shall not march away from the enemy and have to go round the world and come up in their rear.'"
Shortly after midnight, Barlow's division reached the Brown House, which served as Mott's headquarters. The men were told to rest on their arms. Meanwhile, Francis Barlow went to look for Gershom Mott, who was the one man with first-hand knowledge of the ground over which the attack was to be made.
If he found Mott, and in later years Barlow could not recall that he did, he learned nothing of use. However, Barlow did speak with Lieutenant Colonel Waldo Merriman of the 16th Maine. Merriman had participated in the May 10th attack, and Barlow wrote, had, quote, "advanced far enough to obtain some kind of impression as to the enemy's works and the intervening ground. He drew upon the wall a sketch of the position, and this was the sole basis on which the dispositions of my division were made."
Based on Merriman's information, Barlow made his dispositions, then lay down on the floor to grab a few hours' sleep before the attack was slated to begin. While he dozed, the other 2nd Corps commanders arrived, and by 2 a.m., Hancock, Birney, and Gibbon were all at the Brown House.
Gibbon and Birney sat near the fire, talking quietly. Hancock stretched out on a couch and asked to be awakened at 3:30. Meanwhile, in the wet fields around the snug farmhouse, the Federal soldiers were cold and wet, and only the most exhausted men were able to fall asleep. Private John Haley, who served in the 17th Maine in Birney's division, vividly remembered the fog and chill. Quote, "Our teeth chattered and our frames shook like leaves."
Hancock arose at the appointed hour and went outside to observe the conditions. Ordinarily at this time of year, although the sun wouldn't have risen above the horizon, there would still be enough light to conduct operations. But not this morning. This morning there was a thick fog hugging the landscape.
Hancock delayed the attack by half an hour. The troops stood in line of battle, cold, wet, and miserable. When the order to advance finally came at 4:45, the men welcomed the chance to move and generate some warmth. Private Haley recalled the order, quote, "wasn't half so disagreeable as one might think."
Here, on the morning of the 12th, Barlow's division, spearheading the Federal attack, adopted a stacked formation similar to the one Upton's brigade had used on the evening of the 10th. The divisions of Mott and Birney, in conventional line of battle, would go forward on Barlow's right. Gibbon's division brought up the rear.
All told, about 19,000 Federal soldiers began a swift dash toward the Mule Shoe. That's fully a third more men that had taken part in Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. And yet, few of the senior Union officers believed the attack here would succeed. The operation seemed to have been hastily thrown together. The instructions were too vague, and their previous experiences assaulting prepared enemy positions didn't exactly instill confidence.
Such doubts surely transmitted themselves to the men in the ranks, but for the most part, the troops who were wet and cold were simply glad to be moving.
Sheer numbers lent weight to the assault, of course, and must have provided some measure of visceral reassurance. Asked why he was massing his troops in a heavy column when that formation would make an ideal target for rebel artillery, Barlow barked, "If I am to lead this assault, I propose to have men enough when I reach the objective point to charge through hell itself and capture all the artillery they can mass on my front."
But in fact, almost no Confederate guns lay in front of Barlow's column. Misled by reports that the Federals were starting to shift toward Fredericksburg, Robert E. Lee ordered the artillery pieces pulled out of the Mule Shoe in anticipation of the need to make a sudden march to intercept the Federals.
During the night, rebel pickets in front of the Mule Shoe reported a lot of Yankee activity across the way, and Allegheny Johnson, whose division held the apex of the salient, appealed to Dick Ewell in person for the return of the artillery. Ewell agreed, but not until 1 a.m., and his chief of artillery didn't get the word until 3:30, just as across the lines, Winfield Scott Hancock was rising from his nap in the Brown House. The Confederate artillerymen themselves weren't notified until 3:45 or later, which meant they were just beginning to move their guns back into the Mule Shoe when the Federal attack hit.
Amazingly, the Confederate infantry also didn't seem prepared for an attack, even though, since time immemorial, armies have stood to their weapons at dawn. However, here, as the Federals charged out of the fog, most of the rebel pickets were overrun without a shot being fired, and then there was only the briefest spatter of musket fire before the Yankees hit the Mule Shoe.
The Federal attack seems to have taken most of the Confederates completely by surprise. Within minutes, the entire nose of the Mule Shoe was overrun. 20 rebel cannon immediately fell into Union hands, most of them from the batteries just returning to the salient. Hundreds and hundreds of Confederate soldiers raised their hands in surrender. Among the shocked, unhappy prisoners were 2 generals, Allegheny Johnson and one of his brigade commanders, George Maryland Stewart.
In fact, within a span of minutes, Allegheny Johnson's division had all but ceased to exist, as they saw the hundreds of surrendering rebels, reveled in the number of captured artillery pieces, and gawked at the sweep of empty enemy fieldworks. The Federals realized their apparently doomed attack had cracked the Confederate defenses wide open.
In the entire history of the Army of the Potomac, nothing like this had ever happened. A courier hustled back to tell Hancock the news. Hancock, in turn, telegraphed Meade, saying, "Our men have the works, with some hundreds of prisoners. Impossible to say how many. Whole line moving up. This part of the line was held by Ewell."
The excited telegraph operator appended his own postscript to the wire, quote, "General Hancock's troops are in the second-line works."
Those second-line Confederate works were about 100 yards behind the first, and beyond them lay a piney woodland, still shrouded in mist. A few Yankees ventured into the tree line and shot at the Confederates who were fleeing through the woods. However, most Federal units were jumbled and disordered after their dash to the Mule Shoe, and the officers were unsure what to do to follow up the unexpected success of the attack. Barlow's strike column had dissolved into an unarticulated mass. Further advance was therefore impossible until this mob could be reorganized into some semblance of a division again.
Are you still quoting 30-year-old movies? Have you said cool beans in the past 90 days? Do you think Discover isn't widely accepted? If this sounds like you, you're stuck in the past. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back. Welcome to the now. It pays to Discover. Learn more at discover.com/credit card, based on the February 2024 Nielsen report.
Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
While the Federals in the Mule Shoe milled about, incapable of exploiting their success, a few hundred yards beyond the piney woods, Confederate Brigadier General John B. Gordon received the news that a disaster had befallen the defenders of the nearby salient.
Gordon could hardly believe the news, since there had been really no more firing that cold and dreary morning than was usual when the two armies were in contact. But Gordon quickly realized that, improbable or not, it seemed evident that a disaster had indeed befallen Allegheny Johnson's division, and the Federals had overrun much, if not all, of the Mule Shoe.
As the commander of Ewell's Reserve Division, Gordon had standing orders to, at his discretion, reinforce the front when help was needed. This situation certainly seemed to fit the bill, so John B. Gordon immediately set out to do what generals in the Army of Northern Virginia did automatically. He launched a counterattack.
The first Confederate troops at hand were a thin brigade led by Brigadier General Robert D. Johnston. Gordon deployed them in a long, single-rank line and sent them toward the Mule Shoe to buy time. Then, as he was beginning to organize a more substantial force, a familiar figure rode up, Robert E. Lee. Alerted to the disaster by clots of excited men streaming to the rear, past his headquarters several hundred yards away, Lee came to see what was happening for himself.
John B. Gordon spurred his own mount over to Lee, then asked, "What do you want me to do, General?" Seeing that Gordon was already organizing a counterattack, Lee told him to continue what he was doing. Then Lee rode to the center of the still-forming line of battle.
Gordon realized that Robert E. Lee intended to lead the counterattack in person. So, loudly enough for the nearby soldiers to hear, Gordon spoke to Lee, telling him, "Go back, General. We will drive them back. These boys are Virginians and Georgians. They have never failed. They never will. Will you, boys?"
"No, no," the men replied. Then, just as the Texans at the Tap Farm had done 6 days previously, these men began to chant, "Lee to the rear, Lee to the rear."
But when Lee didn't budge, Gordon and other officers inserted their horses between him and the enemy. Finally, a no-nonsense sergeant from Virginia simply grabbed the reins of Lee's mount and swung the horse toward the rear.
With Lee safely out of the way, Gordon finished organizing the counterattack, then sent the 3 brigades crashing forward. Although they were outnumbered by the Federals who had overrun the Mule Shoe, Gordon's Confederates had the advantage since the disorganized Yankees were little more than an armed mob.
After a short, fierce clash, the rebels succeeded in shoving the jumbled mass of Federals back to the tip of the Mule Shoe. 2 additional Confederate brigades arrived to help, and Lee also sent for Mahone's division to come from west of the Po River. Robert E. Lee was pumping reinforcements into the fight as fast as they arrived on the scene.
Meanwhile, the Federals' initial elation had evaporated quickly in the face of the determined Confederate counterattack. At 5 minutes to 6 that morning, Hancock fired off a second wire to Meade, saying that all his troops were engaged and that Wright's 6th Corps must attack at once.
Meade immediately sent word to Wright, and in no time at all, the men of 6th Corps were advancing. However, the Confederates defending this portion of the line, though hard-pressed, were able to hold. Neither side was able to make any headway. The Federals couldn't regain the ground they'd lost in the Mule Shoe, while the Confederates couldn't eject the Yankees from their foothold at the tip of the salient. And so, as the day wore on, the fighting raged unabated until the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania was the scene of some of the most intense, fierce, close-quarters combat of the Civil War.
At their headquarters 2 miles away from the fighting, Grant and Meade received a steady stream of reports. Hancock had clearly won an impressive initial victory. The taking of 3,000 prisoners and 20 guns attested to that. But by 7:30 a.m., it was equally apparent that the situation in the Mule Shoe had reached a stalemate.
Hancock was stymied, Wright seemed stalled, and Burnside, who attacked at the same time as Hancock, didn't seem to be making much of an impression of any kind. That left Warren's Fifth Corps as the sole uncommitted Federal force that might still be able to influence the situation. Grant felt certain that if Lee was fending off 3 Union corps at the Mule Shoe, he must surely be doing it by stripping rebel troops from the rest of his line, and Grant began breathing down Meade's neck to send in Fifth Corps.
And so Meade told Warren to prepare to attack in order to take the heat off Sixth Corps. 30 minutes later, Meade told Warren to strike Laurel Hill at once.
However, Warren balked. This would make the 4th Federal attempt to take Laurel Hill, and from what Warren could tell, Lee had not stripped any rebel troops at all from this part of the Confederate line. In any case, if Meade wanted him to attack, Warren thought the least Meade could do is give him enough time to soften up the rebels with a heavy artillery bombardment, and Warren said as much in a written reply to Meade's instructions. In the meantime, Warren merely nudged Fifth Corps tentatively forward in the direction of Laurel Hill.
Little came of Warren's half-hearted effort. One staff officer admitted the Fifth Corps soldiers, quote, had lost all spirit for that kind of work. Many of them positively refused to go forward.
Those who did go forward were blasted by Confederate artillery posted opposite Wright's Sixth Corps. This led Warren to lodge another objection with headquarters, saying the enemy guns in front of Sixth Corps needed to be silenced by Wright. Andrew Humphreys, Meade's chief of staff, fired off a response, telling Warren, quote, "The order of the Major General commanding is that you attack at once, at all hazards."
Despite the sharp tone of his response, Humphreys sympathized with Warren's predicament, but Humphreys knew something that Warren did not, that Ulysses S. Grant was fed up with Warren's refusal to follow orders, and was now ready to remove Warren from command if he didn't attack Laurel Hill.
15 minutes later, hoping to spare Warren the embarrassment of getting sacked mid-battle, Humphreys sent a second note, saying, "Don't hesitate to attack with the bayonet. Meade has assumed the responsibility and will take the consequences. Your friend, A.A. Humphreys." At that, Gouverneur K. Warren finally bowed to the pressure, and to his division commanders he sent terse, harsh instructions that concluded with the words, "Do it."
Warren's Fifth Corps troops now attacked in earnest, an hour and a half after Meade's original order to assault Laurel Hill. Moving out into the open, they immediately came under a sustained and furious fire from the Confederate entrenchments across the way.
Where the ground provided some shelter as they advanced, a few units reached the screen of abatis in front of the rebel earthworks. But where the ground left them cruelly exposed, the Confederate musket and cannon fire simply swept away the Federals. The dozens of dead and wounded strewn across the wet ground confirmed Gouverneur K. Warren's worst fears. Contrary to Grant's intuition, Lee had not stripped any rebel troops from this part of his line. And Lee didn't need to. A single Confederate division held Laurel Hill, but that formation, well entrenched, with a beautiful field of fire and plenty of ammunition, was more than enough to hold the position against all comers.
By noon, practically the entire Army of the Potomac was in action. 2nd, 5th, and 9th Corps continued to struggle against the Mule Shoe. 5th Corps, repulsed at Laurel Hill, was now transferred piecemeal to the Mule Shoe sector, mostly to support Wright's 6th Corps.
If it were simply a matter of numbers, the Federals now should have overwhelmed the Mule Shoe's defenders. But it was not simply a matter of numbers. In some spots, the Yankee soldiers were stacked up 20 men deep, so their numbers were neutralized. While in other spots, in the minds of the Federal officers, the objective was no longer attacking the rebels, but simply holding on to the gains they had already made. For example, reinforced by the better part of 2 5th Corps divisions, Horatio Wright used those extra men not to re-energize 6th Corps' assault, but simply to buttress his line against a potential Confederate counterattack.
Ulysses S. Grant refused to call off the offensive. He continued to hope that sustained pressure would crack the rebel line. Robert E. Lee, for his part, ordered the Confederate units to continue the fighting at the tip of the Mule Shoe to buy time for the completion of a new line of earthworks that was being hastily thrown up across the base of the salient. Once that new line was completed, the rebel troops at the tip of the Mule Shoe could pull back.
And so the savage fighting at the tip of the Mule Shoe raged all day and into the evening. Neither side gave an inch. Hour after hour, the fierce close-quarters combat continued in the mud and rain. The fighting was bad everywhere, but absolutely horrific at a spot on the Mule Shoe's western shoulder that was known forever after as the Bloody Angle. There, Federal and Confederate soldiers stood yards apart, in some places divided only by the wall of logs that was the trench parapet. The commander of a 6th Corps brigade that fought there said, quote, "Our men would reach over the logs and fire into the faces of the enemy, would stab over with their bayonets. Many were shot and stabbed through the cracks and holes between the logs. Men mounted the works, and with muskets handed them, kept up a continuous fire until they were shot down, while others would take their places and continue the deadly work."
These and similar accounts suggest the struggle was one of continuous ferocity, but human beings simply couldn't have sustained such intensity except in a suicidal frenzy. There's no doubt the combat in the Mule Shoe, in the mud and rain, descended into a savagery rarely equaled during the war, but in reality, the fighting ebbed and flowed through the afternoon and into the evening.
A soldier who estimated he and his comrades shot off 400 rounds that day also remembered that, quote, "Sometimes the enemy's fire would slacken, and the moments would become so monotonous that something would have to be done to stir them up." At times, the combat would subside enough so that Confederate soldiers who wished to give up could go over and have their surrenders accepted. There were reports of exhausted soldiers taking advantage of lulls to go off a few yards and sleep in the mud. The casualty figures confirm the picture of sustained but modulated combat. For example, 6th Corps lost about 1,000 men killed, wounded, and missing on May 12th, out of a force of about 16,000. Since it was engaged for about 20 hours in all, the Corps' loss rate averaged about 50 men per hour.
None of that diminishes the misery and horror that were endured by the soldiers who struggled for the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania. The emotional strain was plainly traumatic, the physical conditions were nightmarish, and the butcher's bill was long and bloody.
By 3 a.m. on the morning of May 13th, when the Confederates had finished their new line of entrenchments across the base of the salient and had successfully pulled back to those works, they had suffered at least 4,000 dead and wounded, with another 4,000 taken prisoner. And the Federals on May 12th lost over 6,000 dead, wounded, and missing.
Despite the Federals' heavy losses, Ulysses S. Grant considered the fighting on May 12th a success, and he wished to keep up the pressure on the Confederates. On the 13th, rain continued to fall, but from the reports of Union skirmishers, Grant concluded that Robert E. Lee was now most vulnerable on his right flank, east of Spotsylvania Courthouse.
On the evening of May 13th, Grant had Meade put 5th Corps and 6th Corps in motion, shifting them behind 2nd and 9th Corps in hopes Warren and Wright could hit the Confederate right flank and turn it. But nothing came of the movement. Mud and rain badly slowed the march, and Lee was able to discover what the Yankees were up to and counter their move against his right.
By the morning of the 16th, Grant conceded in a message to Halleck that after 5 days of almost continuous rain, quote, all offensive operations necessarily cease until we can have 24 hours of dry weather. However, he added, quote, you can assure the President and Secretary of War that the elements alone have suspended hostilities and that it is in no manner due to weakness or exhaustion on our part.
The sun returned the next day, and Grant sent 6th Corps on yet another trek, this time back to the battlefield of May 12th, where Wright would support Hancock's 2nd Corps in a dawn assault on the new Confederate line across the base of the Mule Shoe. The result was simple slaughter. 6 Federal divisions moved into the Mule Shoe for a 4 a.m. assault, but spent so much time getting into position on ground now dubbed Hell's Half Acre that it was 8 a.m. before the attack was finally launched.
By that time, the Confederates knew full well an attack was coming, and as a rebel artillery officer said, quote, it was welcomed as a chance to repay old scores.
The Confederate artillery hurled shell and canister into the Federal ranks and smashed the enemy attack, with little help needed from the rebel infantry. Dick Ewell's artillery chief gushed that the action, quote, fairly illustrates the immense power of artillery, well handled.
Across the lines, George Meade admitted, quote, we found the enemy so strongly entrenched that even Grant thought it was useless to knock our heads against a brick wall, and directed a suspension.
Still, Grant was prepared to continue his strategy of relentless assaults, since he believed Robert E. Lee must be in desperate straits, with Richmond threatened by Butler's Bermuda Hundred campaign, and Sigel, Averill, Crook, and Sheridan denying him reinforcements and supplies, especially from the Shenandoah Valley. But hard on the heels of the latest failure at the Mule Shoe on May 16th, Grant received news that Sigel was in retreat out in the valley and Butler was pulling back into defensive lines at Bermuda Hundred.
Grant understood that these two setbacks meant Lee could now expect to receive thousands of reinforcements to make good the losses he'd suffered at Spotsylvania. In his memoirs, Grant admitted, quote, all this news was very discouraging.
With his strategy of coordinated offensives in Virginia in shambles, Grant realized the Army of the Potomac could no longer continue battering the Confederates at Spotsylvania, expecting the rebels would crack. After all, if Lee, fighting unaided, had successfully repulsed everything Grant and Meade had thrown at him, what chance did the Army of the Potomac have once Lee started to receive reinforcements that were surely on their way? Well, Meade was right. It would be like continuing to knock their heads against a brick wall. So Grant decided it was time to once again slide past the Confederates' flank to find a new, more favorable battlefield. But even as he laid plans for this continuation of the present campaign, Ulysses S. Grant sought more information about what had happened to Sigel and Butler and what had wrecked his grand design to pressure the rebels on multiple fronts in Virginia. And next time we'll look at the collapse of Grant's peripheral strategy.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is A Season of Slaughter, The Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse by Chris Makowski and Christopher D. White.
This is a title in the Emerging Civil War series, and both Makowski and White are former battlefield guides at Spotsylvania, so they know their stuff here. You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
As we wrap up this episode, we just want to say thank you for your patience while we were sick and for the many kind messages of support.
Yep, thanks everyone. It's no fun being sick, and so it feels good to not just be better, but to be back in the saddle again, so to speak, and to get this episode out to all of you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks everyone. Bye.